Rain pounded against the streets of Crestwood that night, turning the pavement into a mosaic of shimmering puddles under the dim glow of the streetlights. Inside the small police station, the atmosphere was calm, almost too quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic tapping of keys as Sheriff Tom Reynolds worked through the last of the day's patrol reports. His face, marked by years of service and streaks of gray in his hair, was etched with fatigue. It seemed like any other night, but deep down, something gnawed at him, a subtle unease he couldn't quite shake. Then it happened. A noise broke through the stillness, faint at first, almost drowned out by the storm. It was an odd sound. Hurried steps, accompanied by the soft scrape of paws against wet concrete. Tom paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, and glanced toward the door. The sound grew louder, closer, until something collided lightly against the glass entrance. When Tom turned to look, his breath caught. Standing there, soaked from the rain, was a familiar figure he thought he'd never see again. Roxy. For years, Roxy had been his loyal partner, a German Shepherd K9 with instincts sharper than any human. Together, they had faced danger, saved lives, and taken down criminals. But 2 years ago, Roxy had been retired from service and adopted by a loving family on a quiet farm outside of town. She was supposed to be safe, far away from the chaos of their old life. Yet here she was, standing at the door, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity he hadn't seen since their days on the field. "Roxy," Tom's voice barely came out, disbelief settling over him as he rose from his chair. The dog barked, a desperate, sharp sound that cut through the hum of the rain. Without hesitation, he opened the door, and Roxy bolted inside, her paws slipping slightly on the wet floor. She was frantic, her body moving with urgency as she circled him, barked again, and then darted toward the door, only to turn back and fix her gaze on him. She was trying to tell him something. It wasn't until Tom knelt beside her that he realized what was wrong. Roxy's belly was swollen, her breaths coming in shallow, labored pants. She was pregnant, very pregnant, and the strain on her body was clear. His heart sank as he studied her trembling form. Why had she run all the way here in such a fragile state? Why wasn't she at home with her new family? Tom felt a chill crawl up his spine as he met her pleading eyes. It wasn't just desperation he saw, it was fear. Roxy wasn't just looking for help. She had come here for a reason. Roxy barked again, louder this time, tugging at the hem of Tom's pants with her teeth as if to pull him toward the door. Something had brought her back to this place. Something urgent and unspoken. Tom's gut told him this night was about to take a turn he could never have anticipated. The story is just getting started. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what happens next. Turn on the notification bell and join us for this thrilling journey with Roxy and Sheriff Tom. Tom grabbed his coat from the back of his chair and followed Roxy out into the storm without hesitation. Rain hit his face like needles, soaking him to the bone within seconds. Roxy moved with purpose, her steps uneven but determined as she led him down the deserted streets of Crestwood. Her swollen belly swayed with each movement, and Tom could see she was struggling. Every few steps, she would pause to catch her breath, her eyes darting back to make sure he was still with her. Whatever had driven her to come to him, it was urgent, and she wasn't giving up. "Roxy, where are we going?" Tom asked, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. She didn't stop or hesitate, just kept moving toward the outskirts of town. Tom's mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. Why had she left her new home? Was her family in danger? Or was there something wrong with her? He couldn't shake the gnawing sense of dread that something bigger was at play. They finally reached the edge of town, where the paved streets gave way to dirt roads leading into the woods. Roxy hesitated for the first time, her paws sinking slightly into the muddy ground. She turned her head, looking at Tom as if asking for reassurance. He knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her head. "It's okay, girl. I'm with you," he said softly, though his own nerves were raw. She let out a small whimper before continuing into the darkness, her steps slower now, her energy visibly waning. As they pressed on, the forest swallowed them. The tall pines blocked out what little light the moon offered, and the only sounds were the rain hitting the canopy above and the soft squelch of their footsteps in the mud. Tom kept his flashlight pointed ahead, its beam cutting through the dark, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, his hand instinctively resting on the holster at his hip. If there was trouble, he was ready. But the question remained, what kind of trouble had Roxy walked into? Then, through the rain and trees, Tom saw a faint glow ahead. It was a house, or what was left of one. The structure was old and dilapidated, its roof partially caved in and its windows shattered. Smoke rose faintly from a chimney, barely visible against the night sky. Roxy stopped at the edge of the clearing, her body trembling, but not from the cold. She let out a low growl, a sound that sent chills up Tom's spine. Someone was here, and whatever was waiting for them inside that house was the reason Roxy had come for him. Tom tightened his grip on the flashlight, his instincts kicking into overdrive. Roxy took a cautious step forward, her eyes locked on the shadows dancing inside the broken windows. Tom knew they were about to uncover something, and whatever it was, it wouldn't be simple. The closer Tom and Roxy got to the crumbling house, the heavier the air seemed to grow. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the broken roof, creating a steady rhythm against the cracked concrete steps leading to the front door. Roxy's ears were pinned back, her tail low, and she let out another low growl, a warning this time. Tom crouched beside her, his hand resting on the flashlight and his other hand hovering near his holstered sidearm. Whatever was inside, Roxy was scared, and that alone was enough to put Tom on edge. He stepped cautiously onto the first creaking step, the wood groaning under his weight. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, barely held in place. Tom pushed it open slowly, the sound of the rusted hinges echoing into the darkened interior. The faint smell of smoke and something else, something metallic and sharp, hit him immediately. Blood. His stomach tightened as he shone the flashlight into the room, revealing an empty, decaying living room strewn with trash and debris. Roxy pushed past him, her instincts on full alert. She moved carefully, sniffing the ground as she went, her body tense. Tom followed, scanning every corner with his light. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. Then, just as Tom reached the center of the room, Roxy froze. Her body went rigid, and she let out a short, sharp bark, her eyes locked on a shadowed corner near the kitchen doorway. Tom swung his flashlight in the direction she was looking and drew his gun. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm, though his pulse raced. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then came a sound, soft at first but unmistakable. A whimper. It wasn't human. Tom lowered the flashlight slightly, stepping closer to the kitchen. The beam of light revealed a pile of torn blankets, and nestled within them were 3 tiny, trembling puppies. They couldn't have been more than a day old, their eyes still closed, their bodies weak and fragile. Roxy rushed to them immediately, letting out soft whines as she began nuzzling them. Relief washed over Tom momentarily, but it was short-lived. As he bent down to get a better look, he noticed something else. A dark stain spreading across the floorboards beneath the blankets. His light moved slowly upward, revealing what lay just beyond the puppies. A man, sprawled on the floor, his body still, his shirt soaked in blood. Tom's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just about Roxy's puppies. Something had gone terribly wrong in this house, and he was standing in the middle of it. Tom's instincts screamed at him to get Roxy and the puppies out of there, but his years as a sheriff wouldn't let him leave without answers. What had happened here, and why had Roxy brought him to this place? As the storm raged outside, Tom realized the night was far from over. What do you think happened in that eerie house? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Why do you think Roxy brought Tom here? We want to hear your theories about what could be behind this chilling discovery. Tom knelt on the creaking floor, his flashlight shaking slightly as he tried to make sense of what was in front of him. The man's body, sprawled near the edge of the room, told a story he didn't fully understand yet. His clothes were stained, and there were no immediate signs of what had caused his collapse. The blood pooling beneath him had dried in places, but something about the scene didn't feel natural. Tom scanned the room, searching for clues, while Roxy stayed close, her body tense as she guarded her puppies nestled in the blanket. Tom's instincts screamed at him to prioritize Roxy and her newborns. He could see the toll the night had taken on her. Her sides heaved as she tried to recover from the journey, and her eyes shifted nervously between him and the door. "It's okay, girl," Tom murmured, his voice soft but firm. He crouched to pet her gently, and she nudged his hand, her eyes speaking volumes. She had brought him here for a reason, but now she needed him to act. Standing slowly, Tom took another look around the room. The broken furniture and scattered debris suggested this house had been abandoned for years, but there were recent footprints in the dirt on the floor. They led toward the back of the house, disappearing into the shadows of the next room. Tom's gut told him that whoever had been here might still be nearby, but he couldn't risk leaving Roxy and her puppies alone. He had to find a way to protect them while figuring out what had happened. "Let's get you out of here," Tom said under his breath. He carefully wrapped the puppies in the blanket, cradling them in his arms as Roxy stood by his side, her ears perked and her posture alert. Together, they moved toward the door, but as they reached the threshold, a sound stopped Tom in his tracks. It was faint but unmistakable, the creak of a floorboard coming from the second floor. He froze, his flashlight aimed at the staircase. Roxy let out a low growl, her body stiffening as she stared toward the stairs. Tom's grip on the flashlight tightened. "Is someone up there?" he called, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. No answer, just the faint sound of another creak, followed by silence. He glanced at Roxy, who looked up at him as if to say she was ready. But Tom knew they couldn't risk staying any longer. They had to move, and fast. Tom stepped outside into the storm with Roxy and the puppies, his mind racing. The mysterious noise upstairs and the unsettling scene inside the house were only the beginning. Whatever had happened here wasn't over, and as they disappeared into the night, Tom knew the answers were still waiting in the shadows. Rain poured down harder as Tom stepped out of the house, cradling the blanket-wrapped puppies tightly in his arms. Roxy stayed close to his side, her ears pinned back and her movements cautious, glancing over her shoulder toward the house they had just left. Tom's mind was a whirlwind of questions. The sound upstairs, the man inside, and Roxy's desperate journey to bring him here. It all painted a picture he couldn't yet decipher. But one thing was clear: they couldn't stay there. As they reached the tree line at the edge of the property, Tom glanced back at the house. The broken windows glinted faintly in the storm's dim light, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move in one of them. His grip on the puppies tightened as he forced himself to turn away. He couldn't afford to let fear or speculation slow him down. Right now, his priority was getting Roxy and her newborns to safety. The rest could wait. "Come on, girl," Tom urged, his voice low but steady. Roxy hesitated for a moment, her body language torn between her instincts to protect and her trust in Tom. With a soft whine, she fell in step beside him, her paws sinking into the muddy ground as they made their way back toward town. The forest around them was eerily quiet except for the rain and the occasional rustle of leaves. Tom's flashlight cast long, shaky beams of light ahead, illuminating the path but leaving shadows looming on either side. About halfway down the trail, Roxy froze. Her body went rigid, and a low growl rumbled from her throat. Tom immediately stopped, his heart pounding as he followed her gaze. The trees ahead swayed in the wind, their branches creaking ominously, but he couldn't see anything unusual. "What is it?" he whispered, scanning the area with his flashlight. Roxy took a step forward, sniffing the air, but whatever had alarmed her seemed to have vanished. Tom's unease deepened. Something or someone was out there. By the time they reached the outskirts of Crestwood, Tom was soaked to the bone and shivering, but he didn't care. The familiar glow of the streetlights brought a fleeting sense of relief. He hurried toward his truck parked outside the station, unlocking it quickly and placing the puppies gently on the passenger seat. Roxy jumped in after them, circling once before lying down protectively over her litter. As Tom closed the door and got behind the wheel, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The rain distorted the view, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had been followed. Tom started the engine and pulled onto the road, but his thoughts were far from the safety of town. Who had been in that house? Why had Roxy come to him instead of staying with her family? And more importantly, what secrets had they just left behind in those dark woods? The storm outside was calming, but the storm inside Tom's mind was only beginning to grow. The truck rumbled down the rain-soaked streets of Crestwood, its headlights cutting through the fading storm. Tom kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the seat next to him, where the puppies huddled close under Roxy's watchful eye. The occasional squeak from the windshield wipers filled the silence. Tom's jaw was tight, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Roxy lay curled around her litter, her eyes darting between the window and him. She looked exhausted, but her body remained tense, as if she were still expecting something, or someone, to appear. Tom parked in front of the station, his usual sense of safety shaken. Crestwood had always been a quiet, predictable town, but tonight felt different. He carried the puppies carefully inside, Roxy following close behind. Once in his office, he laid the pups on an old blanket spread across the floor. They squirmed softly, their tiny forms barely moving. Roxy immediately settled next to them, licking them gently. Tom crouched beside her, running a hand through her damp fur. "You're safe now," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if it was true. Sitting back on his chair, Tom stared at the phone on his desk, debating his next move. He could call animal control to check on Roxy's family. Maybe something had happened at the farm. But then there was the man in the house. That image wouldn't leave his mind. The dried blood, the scattered debris, the eerie creak of the floorboards upstairs. And then there was the shadow in the window as they left. It wasn't just a coincidence that Roxy had shown up tonight. She had come to him for a reason, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in danger. As Tom reached for the phone, the lights in the station flickered, cutting out for a brief moment before buzzing back to life. He froze, his hand hovering above the receiver. A cold knot formed in his stomach. The storm had been rough, sure, but the timing felt off. Roxy's ears perked up, her body stiffening. She let out a low growl, barely audible, but enough to send chills up Tom's spine. Someone was out there. He grabbed his flashlight and stood, his pulse quickening as he moved toward the window. Peering through the rain-streaked glass, Tom scanned the empty parking lot. It was quiet, the streets deserted, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave him. He turned back to Roxy, who was now standing protectively over her puppies. "I don't know what's going on," he muttered, "but I'll find out." The phone on his desk suddenly rang, the sharp sound slicing through the silence. Tom flinched, staring at the phone as it rang again. He hesitated before picking it up. "Sheriff Reynolds," he answered. The line crackled with static, and then a voice came through. A voice that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Sheriff, you should have stayed out of this," the voice said, low and cold, before the line went dead. Tom slowly lowered the phone, his hand trembling. Whatever this was, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The phone slipped from Tom's hand, landing with a dull thud on the desk. The voice echoed in his mind, "You should have stayed out of this." It was a threat, clear and deliberate, meant to rattle him, and it worked. Tom ran a hand over his face, his thoughts spinning as he tried to connect the dots. Who had called him? What did they mean? And how could Roxy and her puppies be tied to something dangerous? He looked over at the loyal German shepherd, now standing alert, her ears pricked forward as if she sensed his unease. Tom's training as a sheriff kicked in. He couldn't afford to panic, not with Roxy and the newborns depending on him. Grabbing his sidearm from the holster, he double-checked the station doors, locking them securely. The flickering lights and the storm outside added to the growing tension in the air, but Tom forced himself to focus. He walked back into the room where Roxy lay, gently petting her as he knelt beside her. "I don't know what kind of trouble you've brought with you," he muttered, "but we'll face it together." Just as he finished speaking, the The station's exterior motion sensor lights flashed on. Tom froze. He hadn't heard a car pull up, nor had anyone called to say they were coming. Rising to his feet, he moved cautiously toward the front window. The rain was lighter now, and through the glass, he could make out a figure standing in the parking lot. They were dressed in a long coat, their face obscured by the hood. Whoever it was, they weren't moving, just standing there, staring directly at the station. Tom's instincts screamed at him to confront the stranger, but something about the situation made him hesitate. He glanced at Roxy, who was growling softly, her body positioned protectively over the puppies. Turning back to the window, Tom grabbed his flashlight and stepped toward the door, his hand resting on the holstered weapon at his hip. He cracked the door open slightly, letting the night air flood into the room. "This is private property," he called out, his voice steady but firm. "State your business, or I'll have to ask you to leave." The figure didn't respond. They stood there for a moment longer, then turned and began walking away, disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the lot. Tom watched them until they were completely out of sight, his grip tightening on the flashlight. Whoever that was, they weren't just a passerby. He closed and locked the door again, his gut telling him this wasn't over. Roxy's gaze met his, her eyes full of quiet understanding. Tom didn't say a word, but in his heart, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever danger was coming, it was getting closer. Tom leaned back against the door, his pulse still racing. The night wasn't over, and now it was clear. Someone was watching them, and they didn't want him digging any deeper into whatever Roxy had uncovered. Tom sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on the station's security monitor. The parking lot was empty now, but the figure from earlier lingered in his thoughts like a shadow he couldn't shake. He replayed the scene in his mind, how they stood motionless, staring at the station, as if they were waiting for something. The phone call, the body in the house, Roxy's desperate arrival. It was all connected. He just didn't know how yet. His gaze drifted to Roxy, who lay curled around her puppies in the corner, her ears twitching at every little sound. She was exhausted, but her instincts hadn't dulled. The lights flickered again, pulling Tom from his thoughts. The storm had mostly passed, but the air in the station felt heavy, almost suffocating. Tom grabbed his notepad, jotting down the details. The call, the man in the house, the figure outside. As he wrote, the feeling of being watched crept over him again. His eyes darted to the window, but the lot was still empty. He stood, moving to the door, and peered through the glass. Everything seemed calm, but his gut told him otherwise. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, Roxy let out a sharp bark. Tom spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. She was on her feet now, standing protectively over her puppies, her body tense and her gaze fixed on the back of the station. Tom's pulse quickened. He grabbed his flashlight and moved toward the hallway that led to the rear exit. The station was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the lights overhead. As he neared the door, a faint metallic sound reached his ears. A soft click followed by the creak of the back gate swinging open. Tom's breath caught in his throat. Someone was there. He pressed his back against the wall beside the door, his weapon drawn. "Whoever's out there," he called, his voice firm but low, "you're trespassing on police property. Step into the light with your hands up." Silence. The only response was the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. Tom's grip tightened on the gun as he slowly turned the handle and opened the door. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the empty alley behind the station. The gate hung slightly ajar, swaying in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone. Tom closed the door, locking it securely before returning to the main room. Roxy hadn't moved, her eyes still locked on the hallway. Tom crouched next to her, running a hand gently over her head. "It's okay," he whispered, though the words felt hollow. He didn't believe them himself. Roxy nudged his hand, her soft whimper breaking his heart. Tom sat back, his thoughts racing. Whoever was out there, they were testing him, probing, waiting. And Tom knew, deep down, that the real danger hadn't even begun. Tom sat in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He glanced at Roxy and her puppies, then at the locked doors and the dim security monitors. This wasn't a random encounter. Someone was playing a game, and Tom was about to find out just how high the stakes really were. The station felt smaller now, the air thick with tension as Tom tried to piece everything together. He sat at his desk, staring at the notepad where he'd scrawled fragments of the night's events. The phone call, the shadowy figure, the sound at the back gate. His gut told him this wasn't random. Whoever was behind this had a purpose, and Roxy was at the center of it. He glanced over at her. She was restless now, pacing back and forth in front of her puppies, her ears flicking at every faint sound. Tom had never seen her like this, not even during their most dangerous cases. Just as he began to rise from his chair, the station phone rang again, shrill and jarring in the quiet room. Tom grabbed it on the first ring, his heart pounding. "Sheriff Reynolds," he answered, his voice firm. There was static at first, then the same low, cold voice from earlier. "You're too late, Sheriff," the man said, his words deliberate and calm. "You should have left the house when you had the chance." The line went dead before Tom could respond. He stared at the phone in his hand, a sinking feeling twisting in his gut. The words replayed in his head. "You're too late." Too late for what? He stood quickly, grabbing his flashlight and sidearm. He looked down at Roxy, who was staring at him now, as if she understood something he didn't. "Stay here," he murmured, but Roxy let out a bark of protest, her body rigid. Tom hesitated, his instincts warring with his fear. Whoever was behind this clearly wasn't finished, and the call felt like a taunt, a challenge. Tom decided he couldn't ignore it. He moved to the front of the station, scanning the parking lot through the glass. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the shadows seemed deeper now, stretching across the empty pavement. Suddenly, the faint beam of a flashlight caught his eye, flickering in the woods at the edge of town. His chest tightened. Whoever was out there wanted him to follow. Against his better judgment, Tom pushed open the door, stepping into the cold night air. Roxy barked again, louder this time, her body tense as she tried to follow, but Tom turned back to her. "Stay with the puppies," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. As he walked toward the woods, the flashlight beam disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. Tom's own flashlight illuminated the wet ground, where footprints led deeper into the trees. The farther he went, the quieter it became, the sounds of the town fading behind him. His instincts screamed that he was walking into a trap, but he couldn't turn back now. The footprints came to an abrupt stop in a small clearing. Tom scanned the area, his pulse racing. The only thing in the clearing was a single object hanging from a low branch, a small, tattered collar. It was Roxy's. Tom's breath caught as he reached for the collar, his mind racing. How had it ended up here? And what kind of message was the caller trying to send? The clearing was too quiet, and Tom knew the truth was closing in on him, but it wasn't going to wait for long. Tom stood in the clearing, the rain dripping from the trees above, staring at Roxy's old collar dangling from the branch. His hand trembled as he touched it, the worn leather sparking memories of their years together on the force. This wasn't just a message, it was a warning. Whoever was behind this wanted him to know that they had been watching, that they understood the bond between him and Roxy. But why? Tom's mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to leave, but he couldn't, not without answers. The snap of a twig broke the silence, and Tom spun around, his flashlight sweeping the darkness. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice cutting through the cold night air. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the faint glow of Tom's flashlight. It was a man, older, with sharp features and a calm, almost smug expression. He wore a long coat, its hem muddy from the rain-soaked ground. In his hand, he held something small, a folded piece of paper. "I warned you, Sheriff," the man said, his voice low and deliberate. "You should have stayed out of this." Tom didn't lower his gun, his jaw tightening as he demanded, "Who are you? What do you want?" The man smirked, unfazed by the weapon pointed at him. "What I want doesn't matter," he said, tossing the paper toward Tom. It fluttered to the ground at his feet. What matters is the truth. She brought you into this because she trusts you. But trust can be dangerous, Sheriff. Tom bent down cautiously, never taking his eyes off the man, and picked up the paper. Unfolding it, he saw a faded photograph, a younger Roxy, alongside another German shepherd. The other dog looked almost identical to her, their features so similar it could have been her twin. On the back of the photograph were the words, "They took everything from me." Tom's chest tightened as realization set in. Roxy hadn't just come to him for help. She had come to him because someone had targeted her family. Her escape to the station wasn't just instinct, it was survival. Before Tom could ask another question, the man took a step back into the shadows. "This isn't over, Sheriff," he said, his voice fading as the darkness swallowed him whole. "But you'd better be ready for what's coming." Tom rushed forward, his flashlight slicing through the trees, but the man was gone. The only sound was the rain, now soft and steady. As Tom turned back toward the station, clutching the photograph, he realized the danger wasn't just about Roxy. Whatever this was, it was far bigger than he'd imagined, and it wasn't going to stop. Back at the station, Tom found Roxy curled protectively around her puppies, her eyes meeting his as he stepped inside. She let out a soft whine, sensing the weight of what he'd uncovered. Tom knelt beside her, running a hand over her fur. "We'll figure this out," he murmured. But deep down, he knew the fight was just beginning. Roxy hadn't just brought him into her past. She had brought him into a battle for their future. And no matter what came next, Tom wouldn't let her face it alone. Did this story captivate you? Want more adventures like Tom and Roxy's? Show your support with a super sticker. Every contribution helps keep these emotional narratives alive and allows us to continue sharing unforgettable moments with you. Click the button below and choose a super sticker to support our channel.